ahead and start recording this session for those colleagues who weren't able to join us or aren't able to join us so they can hear it later on. So let me just start by reviewing some of the objectives for this online training. And perhaps I'll just start with this background to remind everyone that when we met together in March of last year, the idea was that it would be good for all of us to learn a little bit more about what consumption monitoring is, given that that's part of this working group's name, Consumption Monitoring and Program Impact. And so we thought it would be great for us to have a face-to-face meeting in the near future, but in the interim that we would hold this online training just to start giving everyone some basic elements on what consumption monitoring and as well as nutrition surveillance are. So I'm getting someone online. Maybe it's Rosemary. The manager FSN, maybe that's Rosemary. So Rosemary, I'm going to make you the presenter. There you go. So Manager FSN, I just made you the presenter, and you should now be able to share your screen with us. In order to do that, go under Screen and say Start Sharing My Screen, and you click on that. I'm not hearing any audio. Is anyone else hearing audio?
Yeah, I'm hearing you, Helena, but I don't see anything on the screen except the chat.
Okay. So Rosemary, if you're if you're currently trying to, I'm sorry, we're not able to hear you, Rosemary. So let me go back and try to just continue with the introduction. Okay, so let me just continue. So we have set these 3 objectives for today's online training, and again, just to repeat that we are recording this training, so others who aren't able to join us can listen to it later on. So by the end of this training, we should all be able to distinguish among internal monitoring, regulatory monitoring, consumption monitoring, and nutrition surveillance in the context of food fortification, which is what's bringing us together today to talk about food fortification. Our second objective is to be able to define what consumption monitoring and nutrition surveillance are. And finally, thanks to presentations from Mozambique and Guatemala, we should be able to cite country examples of consumption monitoring and nutrition surveillance activities as they relate to food fortification. So before going any further, are there any questions on the objectives for today's training? Does anyone have any questions? Celestine, Doreen, Felistus, John? So I'm getting some background from Celestine, so I'm going to go ahead and mute. And I will now move into the first presentation. So actually, let me go through the agenda. So we just completed a very brief background and objectives of the training. I will give a description of consumption monitoring. Then Svenja Jung-Johan from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition will describe a case study on consumption monitoring from Mozambique. Rafael Flores Ayala from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention will describe nutrition surveillance. And then Mireia Palmieri from the Nutrition Institute of Central America and Panama will give a case study from Guatemala on nutrition surveillance. Then Rafael will lead us through a question and answer period, and at the end, we're hoping Rosemary can join us to do the wrap-up and next steps. So with that introduction as well as to the agenda, why don't I go ahead and give the first presentation on consumption monitoring. So I'm going to pull up my presentation. All of you have it as well. And again, this is an introduction to consumption monitoring. In 2006, the World Health Organization and FAO published what we affectionately call the Orange Book, these guidelines on food fortification with micronutrients. In that book, they presented a monitoring and evaluation system for food fortification programs. Today in the presentation, I'm going to describe three components of that monitoring and evaluation system: internal monitoring, regulatory monitoring, and consumption monitoring. Despite the use of the word monitoring, these terms mean very different things, and that's why we wanted to get some clarity about what they mean. Virtually any industrialized processed food can be fortified, such as the foods shown on this slide. Now in this presentation, all of the examples I will give are going to be related to grains. To wheat flour, to maize flour, and to rice. However, the principles of consumption monitoring apply to any fortified food. There are two main groups in a country who are responsible for ensuring that the flour is fortified to that country's standards. They are millers and government authorities. Millers complete internal monitoring, while government authorities complete external, import, and commercial monitoring. And the monitoring done by governments is called regulatory monitoring. The reason we fortify food is to increase the vitamins and minerals that people consume. Are people actually eating as much nutrients from fortified food as we had expected when we planned the program? Have there been changes in people's dietary habits that could affect the impact of fortified food? These are the kinds of questions we answer with consumption monitoring. If the full potential of fortification is not being realized, then we need to make changes to the program. Consumption monitoring can be completed by different groups, such as government authorities, research institutions, non-governmental organizations, and consumer protection groups. What I'm going to do next is briefly describe internal monitoring, regulatory monitoring, and consumption monitoring in some more detail. So this is John. He's the quality control manager at a maize mill, and he's checking the feeder, which is the machine that adds vitamins and minerals to flour. He's checking to make sure that the feeder dispenses the right amount of vitamins and minerals to the flour. He will do this at least once per shift every day that the fortified maize flour is produced in the mill. It's just one of the quality procedures that he and other millers follow to ensure that flour is fortified to the country's standards. And this is an example of internal monitoring by millers. On the left, we have Maya. She's an inspector with the Food Control Authority who arrived unannounced at the mill. She is reviewing the location and label of the vitamin and mineral premix stored in the mill's warehouse. She is also reviewing the mill's documentation that shows that the premix contains all of the nutrients specified in the country's standards. This is an example of external monitoring, which itself is a type of regulatory monitoring, which we said is the type of monitoring done by government authorities. I'm getting some noise, so I'm going to go ahead and mute Arthur, and we'll go back to the presentation. So Salima, the person at the right-hand side of this photo, works for a non-governmental organization. She is interviewing Mrs. Diallo about wheat flour and flour-based foods such as roti and bread. This is an example of how we collect information for consumption monitoring. To assess consumption monitoring, here's an example of the questions that Salima asked about the wheat flour the household uses. Question 1. What types of flour do you use in your home? Here Salima asks for the brand, producer, flour type, and source. Question 2. For the type of flour most consumed, what quantity do you typically use in a day? And question 3, may I take a sample of this flour for posterior analysis, post-analysis? Mrs. Diallo doesn't buy wheat flour for use in her home. Instead, she buys roti that is made from wheat flour. So Salima asked her these questions as well. Question 4, do you consume roti in your home? Question 5, what is the brand and producer name of the roti you typically consume in a day? Question 6, for roti, what quantity do you typically consume in a day? And question 7, may I take a sample of this food, again, for future analysis of that food. With the consumption monitoring questions asked in the previous slides, we can calculate these 4 indicators. On this slide, the indicators are specific to flour, but they can be calculated for any fortified food. They are the percentage of households consuming flour that is confirmed to be fortified. Then, the average additional content of micronutrients in flour that should be fortified. We call that fortifiable flour, flour that should be fortified. Third, we have the average daily intake of flour that should be fortified. And finally, we have the average additional amount of micronutrients delivered by the consumption of flour that should be fortified. So what we're going to do next is look at an example of how to calculate the 4th indicator, which we call micronutrient utilization or intake. It is calculated with the information gathered for the 2nd and 3rd indicators on this slide. Here's a fictitious example of how micronutrient intake from fortified flour is calculated. In this example, regulatory monitoring data were collected annually from 2013 through 2015, and specifically from external monitoring visits to mills, food control inspectors took maize flour samples and had them analyzed in the public health laboratory for zinc. On the right-hand side, we have an image of a household income and expenditure survey that was conducted in the country in 2010 by the Ministry of Finance. The information was used to get apparent consumption of maize flour in grams per capita per day. Here we have results for 3 of the households interviewed in that HIES survey. In 2010, the apparent consumption of maize flour was 118, 89, and 106 grams per capita per day for households 1, 2, and 3, respectively. The samples taken from the maize mills in 2013 had an average zinc content of 24 milligrams per kilogram of maize flour. In 2014 and 15, the samples had an average content of 29 and 30 milligrams per kilogram, respectively. The apparent consumption of maize flour multiplied by the zinc content of flour and divided by 1,000 yields the apparent consumption of zinc from flour expressed in milligrams per capita per day. We see that in 2013 in household 1, 2.8 milligrams of zinc from fortified maize was consumed per capita per day. So what do we do with the information we calculated in the previous slide? First, we should compare it to goals established for the program. If the results do not meet program goals, then the food fortification program should be strengthened. This could be making adjustments to the country standards, to internal monitoring procedures, to regulatory monitoring procedures, and maybe some other changes. Also, after looking at consumption monitoring results for several years, you will see if the trend suggests that the target population is consistently getting an important contribution of micronutrients from the fortified food. If so, then it may be the right time to complete an impact evaluation of the program. Remember that a traditional impact evaluation can only be completed if there are baseline data available from before the time fortification began. So in summary, consumption monitoring assesses the potential dietary impact of fortified food. It is different from import monitoring and regulatory monitoring. I'm sorry, what I intended to say there is that it's different from internal monitoring done by mills and regulatory monitoring done by government authorities. Now, one of the advantages is that we can use information from regulatory monitoring to calculate consumption monitoring indicators. Most importantly, the results from consumption monitoring should be used to strengthen the fortification program, and they can also be used to determine if the time is right to conduct an impact evaluation. Thank you very much. Here is my contact information, and I'm now going to try to hand it over to Rosemary. Rosemary, you should be able to speak, Rosemary. So Rosemary, I understand you're in Doreen's computer. Your microphone is not muted, so you should be able to speak if you would like. So we appear to continue to have technical difficulties. Svenja, can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great, Svenja. I'm now going to make you the presenter. So if you can bring up your PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to make you the presenter, and you will just advance the slides as you normally